Hi, welcome to the second installment of my lecture for Chapter 2 of David Schweickart After Capitalism. At the end of the last mini lecture, we ended with this moral question that David Schweickart posed, which is about how to justify the entitlement of the capitalist to the passive income she derives from the capital she owns. In this lecture, I want to set out a classical answer, actually a neoclassical answer to this question that Schweickart discusses. And I also want to discuss his critique of that answer to that question. So this is an answer that comes from Neoclassical Economics. And there's going to be a little bit of math here, a little bit of a way of thinking about things that is not the typical way of thinking about things that you see in philosophy lectures. But I think it's important to at least have the beginnings of an idea of a common argument that you see from the economics literature about the justification of returns that capitalists are able to get from their incomes as a matter of kind of justice. Okay, now to understand this neoclassical answer, there's a few concepts we need to understand, and the big one is this concept, this notion of a marginal product. And ultimately, by understanding the idea of a marginal product, we're going to be able to understand this idea of a capitalist's contribution. Actually, we'll be able to understand the idea of the contribution of labor and the contribution of yet other factors of production. But the thing that we're really, interested in is this idea of the capitalist contribution, because our question is about the capitalist entitlement to the return. And the idea is that once we understand their contribution to the productive process, that then we might understand why they're entitled to a certain amount of income, given that such is their contribution to the productive process. And then, of course, we want to understand this idea of the argument for the idea that there's a certain entitlement to the market value of this contribution. All these notions are interrelated. But one thing I would say is keep your eye on this idea of the marginal product. That's sort of the keystone of the whole thing. Once you understand that idea, then all the other ones are going to be a lot easier to understand. They'll kind of all fall into place. Okay, so here I want to help you get a handle on this idea of a marginal product. So here we have a really crude kind of bar chart where I've got these columns. And so if you look at this thing, I've got, in the vertical axis, we've got bushels of corn. So the tallest bar that we've got here is indicating the production of 15 bushels of corn. Now on the horizontal axis of this chart, we've got number of laborers. And then we're imagining that we've got something like 5 acres of land. And so we've got, so we have this really simple model of like a little mini economy where you've got this 5 acres of land and you have these laborers working it. And what this chart tells us is if one laborer works this piece of land, then the land will yield 12 bushels of corn. And then if you have 2 laborers working this piece of land, then the land will yield 25 bushels of corn. And then if you have 3 laborers, you have to add 25 and 15, because you look at that third laborer. That third laborer is going to bring 15 more bushels of corn. Then you'll have 40 bushels of corn produced on this land after a year. And you go on and on. I'm not going to tediously do the math going all the way through. But one thing to notice is that as you add a laborer, the amount of bushels of corn that you are able to produce in addition, it changes. Like up to 3 laborers, they get more and more efficient. The production gets more and more efficient. And after 3 laborers, you get diminishing returns. Like you get less bang for your additional laborer each time you add more. But you still get more bushels of corn by adding another laborer. And this goes on and on and on. And at some point, you get 0 or maybe even a negative return by adding another laborer. But you could go on and on and on. Now, the marginal product is just simply the amount that the very last laborer added to the production process brings with it. So in this case, we're imagining a 5-acre plot of land where 10 laborers have worked that plot of land for a year, and by adding that 10th laborer, you got 6 more bushels of corn than you would have gotten if you just had 9 laborers working the land. The marginal product is that 6 final bushels of labor. That's 6 final bushels of corn. Now notice the marginal product could have been different. It could have been that whoever's running this farm decided, you know what, we're just going to do 9 laborers. And in that case, you'd have to look at that 9th laborer to see what the additional amount was. In that case, the additional, the marginal product would have been 8 bushels of corn. And you could do the whole thing. You could do this, all along the way. Well, imagine what the marginal product would have been had you just had 5 laborers, and then you look at the 5 column. You say, oh, marginal product would have been 12 bushels of corn. But in fact, in this particular little example, we have 10 laborers who worked the 5 acres of land, and that 10th laborer, by adding that 10th laborer, we were able to extract 6 more bushels of corn. That's the marginal product. Now, you can do this, you can find a marginal product for any factor of production. How many people you have laboring on a plot of land is one factor of production. Another factor of production is how much land are you going to work. The land itself is a factor of production, and you can find a marginal product for it. You can hold the other things constant, so you can say, okay, we're going to have 10 people work, however much land we've got. What happens if we just have them work 1 acre of land? Well, then they'll just produce so many bushels of corn. I haven't given you a number here with this chart, but we just imagine what that number would be if we just had 1 acre of land. But if you do 2 acres of land, you get quite a bit more bushels of corn, and you on and on and on. And you can do a marginal product, just like we did in the other thing, but we can do it with respect to the land. And then the marginal product for the land in this case, I'm going to just use the variable x, because I didn't actually give you numbers in the vertical axis here. So we've got x bushels. Now, there's also, you can do this with any factor of production. We've done it with the laborer. That's one factor of production. I've shown you the general idea of how you would derive marginal product for the land. Well, you could also do it for capital. So let's imagine that these laborers, they use agricultural machines to work this land, and say, and you could do the same thing. Well, they could use 8 agricultural machines or 7 agricultural machines, and so on. And you can find a marginal product in that way. If we we might say, and then that factor of production we'll call the capital, and we would be able to get the marginal product for the capital as a factor of production. Now, as an aside, I should say it's a really tricky question about how to divide the increments of capital and the different kinds of things that are capital other than land and labor. But in principle, the idea is that those things can be sorted out, and then we could figure out the marginal product for any of these inputs to the production process that ultimately, in this case, results in the bushels of corn. Just to be clear, we could do this with the production of anything. It doesn't have to be corn. It could be, it could be cars. It could be toothbrushes. It could be whatever is made in some process of economic production. Okay, so hopefully you have an idea. You have a handle on this notion of a marginal product now. Now, Neoclassical Economics, as Schweickart describing it in Chapter 2, this way of looking at things equates the marginal product of some particular factor as what they call this is the contribution of that input. So we're going to say that, look, the marginal product of labor, say, back here in this graph, which was 6 bushels of corn, the marginal product of 6 bushels of corn is what we're going to call the contribution of the labor input. And in fact, and here's the interesting thing, this might be a little counterintuitive, we're going to say the contribution of all the laborers together is the number of laborers times that marginal product of the last laborer added to the production process. So we're going to say the contribution of labor, in this case, is 60 bushels of corn. That's this gray shaded part. So the contribution of labor to the process is going to be accounted for as 60 bushels of corn out of, well, something that's a lot more than 60, because you can see the bars, they go above the gray shaded part, which is the 60 bushels of corn. But the idea is that neoclassical economics understands the contribution of labor as its marginal product multiplied times the number of laborers. And you could get a contribution for any input in the same way. The contribution of each acre of land is going to be set at X bushels, whatever that marginal product is. And so it'll be the contribution of each acre of land will be estimated as 5 times X bushels, whatever that turns out to be. Now, a really interesting finding, it's a theoretical finding, it's a kind of mathematical finding in the economics literature, is that if you do this under the right conditions, and these conditions, it turns out that mathematically the contribution of each component, so the contribution of, say, the capital, the agricultural machinery, the contribution of the amount of land, and the contribution of the laborers, it'll always work out to equal the total amount of stuff produced. That's a kind of cool finding in economics, that always works out if you set up the math correctly. So anyway, so the idea is that the marginal product of an input is going to be the basis for getting the contribution of that input. Now here things start to have a little bit of bite when it comes to when it comes to Schweickart question. It's going to help us start thinking about the entitlement of different aspects of this production process to a return. So let's think about this laborer again. We go back here. We look at, as I said, look, neoclassical economics is going to say, look, the contribution of laborers in this case is 60 bushels of corn, and so there's some simplifying assumptions in all this, but one of the simplifying assumptions is going to be that each of these laborers is perfectly interchangeable. We could make things more complex, and the point I'm about to describe would still hold, suitably modified to take in the complexities. But let's just assume that each laborer is interchangeable. Like they bring as much, equal amounts of know-how. Every single one of them. No one of these laborers is better than another one of them. But the idea here that neoclassical economics wants to bring is that, look, the contribution of all of these laborers together is 60 bushels of corn. And the idea is going to be that, look, those laborers have a special connection to that 60 bushels of corn. That is their contribution collectively to this process. And there's two different theses that we want to distinguish. One thesis is going to be a kind of theoretical finding, kind of a matter of descriptive fact of a sort. Another thesis is going to be a moral thesis. The thesis that's a matter of theoretical finding, it's another cool, surprising mathematical, economics modeling mathematical finding. It's that if you have a perfectly competitive market, for the sale of the corn that's produced by these laborers, it's going to turn out that the amount of that the wages of these laborers is going to get set at exactly the price of 60 bushels of corn on that perfectly competitive market. So if you have a perfectly competitive market for where folks are selling their labor, and a perfectly competitive market where the corn's getting sold, it's going to turn out that the laborers are going to get in this perfectly competitive market. This is a theoretical finding. They will actually get the contribution, this 60 bushels of corn that we've kind of carved out here with the gray part of the graph. Similarly, it's going to turn out that capitalists are going to get, they're going to get in these perfectly competitive markets, if the markets were perfectly competitive, they're going to get a rate of return on their capital investment that exactly equals their contribution. So let's say that just to make things really simple here, say that you had capitalists involved in this. The capitalists bought the agricultural machines, right? And I mentioned that the agricultural machines, they have a marginal product as well. The idea would be if the only thing the capitalists bought was the agricultural machines, they would actually get a return on investment that exactly equaled the amount of contribution that would be allocated in this way to the addition of the last agricultural machine in the process. So there's this interesting theoretical finding that each component, each factor of production in a perfectly competitive market will actually get in return on the market the amount of contribution that is ascribed to it using this process of ascribing a contribution to each factor of production. Okay. So here, let me just restate this. Here's a slide where I just make this point again. In a perfectly competitive market, the labor wage rate is set at the marginal product of labor. The rental rate of land is set at the marginal product of land, and the interest rate is set at the marginal product of capital. And so just to make this crystal clear, one last time, and I'm just going to do it with labor this time, but you can do it the same way with the capital or land, the same little process. In a perfectly competitive market, in that little toy model that I just gave you, the labor wage rate is going to be set for each laborer at the market value of 6 bushels of corn. That's how much in a perfectly competitive market, that is exactly how much each laborer will get paid. 6 bushels of corn, assuming the laborers are equal in their skills and abilities, and they'll get paid the market value of 6 bushels of corn. The same thing would apply to the land. Whoever owns this land, that landlord will get a rent in the amount of X bushels of corn, and maybe the capitalists contributed the agricultural machines, and they would get a return on their income that would be in the amount of the marginal product of each agricultural machine. Okay. So I think that's a really interesting theoretical finding in neoclassical economics. But here's Schweikart's big claim, and here's where things get a little dicey. Schweickart wants to warn us against concluding from this theoretical finding to a moral claim. And this should be pretty clear. Here's another thesis. So we have this one neoclassical finding about what will happen in a perfectly competitive market. How much people will be paid in this perfectly competitive market, how much return they will get as a matter of fact. But here's a thesis that Schweickart says, look, we need to distinguish these theses, and folks often don't realize there are two different, that we slide subtly from one to another. Here's another thesis that's not the same as the one that I just described, but it's awfully close, crucially different. This thesis says landlords, capitalists, and laborers are morally entitled to receive compensation equal to the perfectly competitive market value of their marginal product. Okay, look, we've just slipped here. We subtly shifted the claim. The first claim was, in a perfectly competitive market, the labor wage rate is set at the marginal product of labor. The rental rate of land is set at the marginal product of land, and the interest rate, the capitalist return, is set at the marginal product of capital. This is a claim about the way things are. It's a theoretical finding. This second claim is a claim about how things ought to be, what's appropriate, what's justified. Landlord, capitalists, and laborers are morally entitled to receive the compensation that the perfectly competitive market would deliver. And Schweickart wants to say, wait, we need an argument for that. So here, I'll just read out my bullet points. Neoclassical theory tells us what the returns to landlords, capitalists, and labor will be in a perfectly competitive market. It does not establish that those returns are just. The neoclassical thesis is an account of the way that perfectly competitive markets work. It does not follow from the fact that perfectly competitive markets work this way, that the returns it generates are just. A moral argument of some sort is needed for that. Okay, now then in the next part of the chapter, Schweickart wants to pile on here a bit and say, look, there's reasons to doubt that the distribution that you get in the perfectly competitive market is a just one. First, one thing that's worth mentioning is that, look, markets out there in the real world, they're not perfectly competitive. So it's not even clear that any of this stuff can apply to the real world. But setting that aside, even if they were, Schweickart wants to question the exact nature of the landowner's or capitalist contribution. And here I'm going to say something very, very similar to what I said in the first lecture, but maybe now it's clearer. What Schweickart wants to point out is, look, the capitalist contributed capital in a technical sense once, and then gets return on that contribution year after year for that one contribution. So the capitalist buys the agricultural machines, and then gets a return year after year on the contribution of that of the agricultural machines. Very similarly, there will be a landlord here, and the landlord just owns those acres of land and gets a return on those acres of land. But all they've done is, at some point in time, they bought those things. By contrast, the worker's contribution is continuous. They work the capital year after year. Now, what Schweickart wants to say is that, look, there's something puzzling. There's something that maybe flags some people's intuitions, that there might be concerns about why exactly the capitalist is entitled to get this year after year return for this one little thing they did, and if so, if they get it, there's this further idea that should it be in nearly a comparable amount to what the worker gets who works these things every year. And Schweikart's intuition anyway is that, well, no. And to stoke this intuition in his readers, Schweickart marshals a quote from John Maynard Keynes, a really famous early to mid-20th century economist. So John Maynard Keynes, I'll mention this about Keynes. Remember we talked about the Great Compression era? Well, that period from 1945 to 1980. Well, that is an era that's associated with Keynesian economics. I just thought I'd mention that as a point of connection between other things we discussed in the class. Okay, but I digress. Let me get back to this idea. Schweickart marshals this quote from Keynes to further motivate or maybe stoke the intuition in his readers that there's something morally puzzling about the capitalist's return year after year. So let me just read this quote. No grant of feudal privilege. Remember, feudal privilege, that's like, so I'm a lord, and just by birth, I get the rents from the manor that I own with all the peasants working the fields. So he's trying to invoke the image of, look, the capitalist is a lot like a lord of a manor here that just is sort of born into this income. No grant of feudal privilege has ever equaled, for effortless return, that of the grandparent who bought and endowed his descendants with 1,000 shares of General Motors or General Electric. The beneficiaries of this foresight have become and remain rich by no exercise of intelligence beyond the decision to do nothing, embracing as it did the decision not to sell. So the idea is that, look, why would you can think of it in two ways. So someone buys a bit of stock and then for the rest of their life, gets money, large amounts of money, years after year after year from this stock. But it even gets more pointed where, well, that stock was then just given to the kids, and those kids live off of that income year after year in one of these big companies. And these folks, the kids certainly did nothing other than refrain from selling. And pretty much the same thing goes for the parents. They just bought the stuff at some point in time, or the grandparents. And so here, what Schweickart trying to do is just motivate this question: like, why should someone get this return for the capital they own year after year? Particularly when you contrast it with the way in which the workers get their return from the capital. They work it year after year, and then you add the further fact that the capitalists get quite a bit of return from this, and when compared to how much the workers get. Okay, so now we're back to Marx's question, which is also Schweikart's question. And here I'll just read Schweickart again. In the neoclassical story, landlords and capitalists are wholly passive. So remember, this is the neoclassical economics agrees or has this notion of landlords and capitalists where they do nothing. The models are thinking about folks who make no contribution to the productive process other than they just laid out this initial investment and they refrain from selling, during this process. So in the neoclassical story, landlords and capitalists are wholly passive. They don't supervise workers, they don't invent anything, they don't make any decisions as to what to produce or what technologies to employ. They are wholly absent from the production process. They merely grant permission for their land and capital to be used in exchange for a healthy cut of the proceeds. But granting permission is not an activity that can be defined technically without regard to specific laws or institutions. So Marx's question retains its bite. To produce material goods, we need human labor and we need non-human raw materials. But why do we need landlords? Why do we need capitalists? So here Schweickart is driving towards his bigger question that I prefaced in the earlier lecture. Schweikart's bigger question is, look, why do we even need this role of capitalist in the economy at all? It's morally suspect that they get the returns that they get given what they've done and the ways they relate to the production process. Because the ways they relate is they're just these passive, absentee presences in the whole process. They just get this return year after year for doing nothing other than not selling. And also by making the initial investment. But Schweikart's idea is like, look, do we really have to have these folks in the process at all? Like what is their added value such that they're entitled to a return? And the added value is defined in moral terms and not this mathematical theoretical equation. What is it that these capitalists do that entitles them to get this yearly substantial income from their ownership? And one thing that Schweickart points out is, look, the rules of how the economy works are up to us. A capitalist, someone who's able to get a return on income from corporate shares they own, that's only possible because we've made rules such that those are the rules, that the economy can work that way. That's not a natural feature. That's something that we have to make rules to create. There's no corporations, there's no corporate stock, there's no capital that guarantees you return without laws that make it that way. And Schweikart's going to say, look, why should we have laws that create the possibility of these class of people who can earn comfortable livings solely off of their capital? Why should there be people like that? Why should we allow that? What role does that play in the economy such that we must have them? And the remainder of chapter 2, which I'll discuss a bit in yet a third installment on chapter 2, he considers 3 different explanations for why we absolutely must have capitalists, and he tries to knock all 3 of them down. In chapters 3 and 4, it becomes clear that the case becomes even more pointed, I think. He argues, particularly in chapter 4, that having this particular structure is actually a real problem when it comes to domination, because you have a structure like this, you're going to naturally get domination relationships. So he has this kind of 2-punch argument against capitalism. First, we don't need them. Like, we don't need capitalists. We don't need that in our economy to make it a productive, vibrant economy. And then second, there's a lot of problems that come with having them. There's a lot of opportunities for these problematic domination relationships when we have a capitalist role in the system. And so his idea is that, look, he's going to propose this institutional design, which we discuss in chapter 3. He discusses in chapter 3 that maintains a vibrant economy, which actually has quite a bit of room for markets, sale of goods and services on the markets, but it works without a capitalist class. And his idea is that is a better and more just system that doesn't lose the economic vibrancy that we're after. But anyway, I'll end it here, and I will follow up here in a bit with a bit more on chapter 2, where I'm going to discuss these three considerations that Schweickart considers, 3 arguments for why there must be capitalists, and he's going to try to show why those aren't very strong arguments. All right, see you again in a bit. Thanks.